Good evening, everybody. I'm going to call this meeting to order. We have a quorum, only missing one person. And at this point, I'll entertain any additions or modifications to the agenda. I'm not hearing or seeing any. So with that, I motion that we adopt the agenda as is. I'll have a second. Seconded by Shireen. All in favor of adopting the agenda as is, raise your hand to say aye. Aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously. Next agenda item is approval of the minutes from our last meeting, 5/25/2021. Any modifications to the minutes or amendments? Not seeing or hearing any. All in favor of adopting the minutes as is, raise your hand to say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Can I give a second?
Oh, my apologies. Is there a second? Seconded by Stephanie. All in favor, raise your hand to say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those not. Any abstentions? One abstention. Technically two abstentions. So I believe that was Stephanie, myself, Shireen, and Milo in favor, and two abstentions, Kevin and Susan. Which brings us to welcoming our two newest members of the Police Commission. Just want to, I guess, say your name to the microphone for the public.
My name is Kevin Garrison.
My name is Susie Comerford.
Awesome. And thank you guys for stepping up and joining us in this. And hope it's a good 3 years. Awesome.
Me.
Can I just ask a quick question? Do you go by Susie or Susan? Which do you prefer?
I go by Susie.
Susie? Okay, perfect.
S-U-Z-Y.
Awesome. And that moves us to our next agenda item, which is public forum. With that, I'll give it to you, Shannon.
I did not have anybody request to speak virtually, and I don't know if there's anyone in attendance that would like to participate. I can see your hands if you want to raise your hand.
Not seeing or hearing any, which moves us to agenda item 4.01, which is the chief's report. And with that, I'll give the floor to Chief Murad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to the new commissioners. I'm really glad that you came forward to be part of this board and this commission and get to do this work with us. I have some materials on a PowerPoint that I can share. I will start by saying that we were very gratified this month to have the end of the COVID emergency happen. Huge thing for the state, huge thing for Chittenden. I sent a memorandum to the body that stated, quite frankly, that Vermont weathered this pandemic better than the rest of the country. Chittenden County did better than Vermont, and thanks significantly to Mayor Weinberger's leadership, Burlington did better still. And all of you, that is the women and men of the Burlington Police Department, own a piece of that. From our early adoption of hygienic procedures and our decision to close 1 North Avenue, which was difficult to the public, to the establishment of an emergency operations center that ran right out of this room for the first several weeks of the pandemic with all of the department heads and the mayor, to facilitating food drives and vehicle parades. Officers in this department and the men and women of it, our civilian employees, our dispatchers, all played a really important role in how the Queen City came through this crucible. I think that they handled early fear and uncertainty with aplomb. I think that they handled the need to engage and educate rather than enforce. They handled sick people in the community. They handled exposure scares here in the building. And through it all, I think they were a source of stability and steady performance for the city and for our neighbors. And it was a momentous occasion for us to finish that pandemic. That said, there were hundreds of thousands lost across the country and well over 250 people lost here in our state. And many of those were here in Burlington. And that loss and the tragedy of that can't be denied either. But it was a moment that marked more than a year, almost a year and a half of an unprecedented kind of event And I think that the folks inside this agency did a very, very good job of navigating it on behalf of their neighbors. We've had some major events over the past month. We had just to give some things from my most recent shift reports, we've had overdoses and mental health calls and simple assaults. We had an entire shift taken up with a person who his family called saying that he was in a mental health crisis. He ran out of his home in the New North End. We had to bring officers out to track him using a canine to try to find him. There was fear that he was going to harm himself. He ended up in the water. Officers engaged him in the water along with the Coast Guard, along with other agencies responding, and ultimately were able to locate him and bring him back safely. He threatened them at various times with different kinds of implements, and officers were able to use a minimum amount of force in order to bring him into safe custody. But that occupied an entire shift for a long period of time on a Friday night. We've had a number of other large incidents. I think that this body gets our press releases. You know that we had a total of 3 gunfire incidents over the past period of time. 2 of those were associated with large parties at the University of Vermont, and one of those was an actual shooting where a person was struck by gunfire at the corner of the intersection of Main Street and Church Street. That followed an altercation. Detectives did an amazing job of identifying those individuals, of using the cameras that were there at both those parties and also at the fight on Church Street. We have not yet identified our suspects in the 2 discharges at parties where no one was struck. We were able to identify a suspect in the discharge where a person was struck, and working with partners, we're able to put enough pressure on that individual through acquaintances, through family members, that individual appeared in court and has been held without bail. So that is a good result for some good detective work on the part of the folks inside here. I'll move to the data and to the first slide there, please. There we go. So, as you know, last month we introduced priority plan or priority response plan, and these are the incidents that are our priority incidents. The 130 categories that are tracked by our ValCore, and we've divided them into priority 1s, priority 2s, and priority 3s. I do want to point out one thing here. There's a version that's floating around online that, because I made a mistake, has drugs as a priority 1, which it is not. That was simply a mistake. It's corrected here. Drugs is a priority 3, as are drugs possession and drug sale. And I corrected that on a version that was promulgated for the public, and somebody brought it up on social media, so I wanted to address it again here. I show this merely to sort of situate us for what comes next with calls. So here's our incident volume year to date. And you can see year to date, there are a significant change. And when I say year to date, I mean through June 21st, yesterday. Significant decrease there in the incidents that we see from 2017 through 2021. From June 1st to June 21, I looked at just of June, and there's a reason for that. You'll see there, too, there's been a decrease. We went up a little bit this year in June, interesting, which indicates we are getting back to normal. From June 1st through June 21st, there were a total of 1,462 incidents. Of those, 108, or 7.4%, were stacked according to that priority response plan that I showed you. And that was the rationale for showing that priority response plan first. So 7.4%, not a huge number. I'm glad for that number. It indicates that the folks in dispatch and the supervisors on the road and officers are using the priority response plan appropriately. That plan says that only when we have 2 or fewer officers available for response do we implement the plan and then stop responding to priority 3s. So the fact that that's only happened 7.4% of the time of all the incidents suggests that they're using that appropriately. And currently the volume is still something that we have not seen it tick up the way we have been concerned it will. And that brings us to this slide, gives us a picture of that incident volume. And And you can see there that 2021 at the bottom is still very off. It's off compared to 2020, which obviously was, we believe, significantly affected by COVID. But we've had this decrease in overall incidents. I have said before that, and can prove mathematically, that a good percentage of these decreases from 2015 through 2020, really through 2019, from 2015 through 2019, more than half of that decrease stems from a diminishment in proactive enforcement decisions or officer decision to initiate incidents, primarily traffic. So about half of the total decrease is traffic alone.
What does stacked mean?
Stacked is from the previous call. It means that when a call comes in, it won't be answered. The default for dispatch is that every time a call comes in, they send a police officer to that call. So for a call to be stacked, it means that they will say, yes, we have this call. We have initiated an incident number. We're acknowledging to the person that we will send somebody, but not immediately. And sometimes it may, by the time a person is available, that call may not be happening any longer. And there are three kinds of stacked calls. There are stacked calls that are in progress, meaning it's happening now, but we're still not going to send anyone because it's a low priority call that doesn't have a safety component. There are stacked calls that are in the recent past, within an hour or so, and then there are stacked calls that are in the past. And that would include if we only have 2 officers available or fewer, if only 1 officer, and a person calls and says, I just got home from vacation, my house, the front door is crashed and I'm missing items, I've been burglarized, we are not going to respond to take that burglary call until we have more than 2 officers available. That's a past burglary. If a person calls and says, I have a prowler in my house downstairs right now, that is an in-progress burglary, that is a priority 1, and even if we only have 1 officer, we're going to send somebody to that call to address it as best as we can.
Thank you.
The next, please. This, however, is our priority 1 incidents. And our priority 1 incidents, we do not see a change. And right now, as you can see, 2021 is buried in there at the June 1st mark, and it is actually a little bit higher than 2019 and 2020. And we don't see a lot of change in these, and that's important to note. These are, again, I've talked about this a little bit before. Priority 1 incidents are about 7 to 8% of the total incident volume. Therefore, they're not numerical. They're not the highest number of incidents that we have, but we have not seen a change in them. And the part of the reason is this: officers don't make priority 1 calls. Priority 1 calls, incidents that become priority 1 calls, come from the public. And the public is calling us at largely the same rates that it ever has. Not this year. It is drastically diminished, and that is still interesting to me, that 2021 is still so far down. I've said before that the people in this building feel very strongly that that's not going to last. But as much as I say that, I have not seen it change yet in 2021. That's not true of priority 1 incidents, however. Next, please. This is something I wanted to demonstrate just because of where we are, what we're seeing with regard to gunfire incidents here in Burlington and what we're seeing with regard to violent crime around the country. This is for New York City, so this is not for Burlington, Vermont. This is a chart that I made when I was an assistant commissioner in the New York City Police Department. It ends partway through 2016 because that is when I retired from the NYPD. But what we see here is a real pattern for shootings from 2003 to 2012, and a very, very different pattern that began in 2013 and persisted. In 2016, the final data, I believe, for that year was 998 shootings. So although this graph doesn't go through that, it gets to 998, which was lower than any previous year. Something significant had changed in the city. It had a lot to do with precision policing, with resourcing. The NYPD brought aboard well over 2,000 new officers and started digging into very specific criminal actors who were committing gun crime, and doing a lot of investigations into those and digging into them at the same time as it decreased enforcement across almost every other category. Drastically diminished the number of stops, which were street stops, which we do not really do at the BPD, but they did in New York. Drastically reduced those, drastically reduced summonses or tickets, as we call them here in Burlington, and also drastically reduced arrests. And while they drastically reduced those kinds of enforcement encounters with neighbors, they doubled down on a neighborhood policing, community policing initiative, and also doubled down on a targeted or focused enforcement initiative that really got to the heart of shootings. If you can hit the next one, Shannon. So the data here I don't belong to the NYPD anymore, so my data had to come from other sources. This is only through mid-July of those following years. It doesn't show those years that were up above, the 2003 to 2012. It shows 2014 and 2016, 2016 being the first year that it broke below the 1,000 mark. It shows that in 2017 through 2019, they kept that going and actually built on it with that precision policing. And it shows that in 2020, as COVID closures began, and then particularly after George Floyd was murdered, it went off the rails. It went off the rails with regard to shootings, and it has persisted into 2021. And this only goes through May 15 of 2021, but those numbers have not moved any differently. 2021 is still much worse than 2020, which was far, far worse than 2019, and really got back into the territory of an era that the department had thought was closed. If you move to the next. And I bring that up because here in Burlington, we are very fortunate that we have not seen an uptick like that in shootings. We have certainly not seen an uptick like that in homicides, but we have seen an uptick like that in gunfire incidents. Now, gunfire incidents are incidents in which we have probable cause that a firearm was discharged. That means that we are able to recover some kind of evidence, whether it's multiple witness statements, whether it is shell casings, whether it is video evidence. We know if firearm was discharged. And I can send all this to you, Mr. Chair. The next part of a gunfire incident is that we have reasonable suspicion that it was done either at a person or in a reckless way. So reckless would be in a crowd. At a person would be either photographic evidence, video evidence, or witness statement saying he shot at this person. The incident on Main Street, at Church and Main a few nights ago was, at first it appeared to be a gunfire incident. He clearly fires at another person, but he doesn't strike that person. However, the round misses that person and does strike someone else down the street. So that becomes a shooting where a person is struck by a bullet. And it is an aggravated assault or an attempted murder. And then, of course, if it hits the person, it's an actual aggravated assault, not an attempted. And if the person dies, then we have a murder. What we see here is a significant uptick. Those color bands on the far left are the years. So we saw a dozen of these kinds of incidents in 2020, which was really unprecedented. And we've already seen half a dozen this year alone. So we're on track at the halfway mark of the year, just a little short of the halfway mark, and I'll knock on wood, and hope that we don't see any more incidents between now and July 1st, or we'll be ahead of that trend. But it's a disturbing trend, and it's one that we're seeing across the country with violent crime. Crime overall is down across the country in almost every municipality. I believe overall it's down here as a result of that incredibly depressed incident volume. But in other parts of the country, we are seeing significant increases in violent crime with regard to shootings and stranger assaults. Domestic assaults rose during the pandemic. And here in Burlington, while we are fortunate that many of these haven't had direct consequences, that there have been gunfire that hasn't struck people, we've seen a very significant increase that is of concern. Next. This is apropos of what Deputy Chief Lebrecht will be presenting later on tonight, our use of force incident volume. And we see there a significantly decreasing trend. And 2021 is significantly lower as well. So the reduced volume of incident comes with a reduced volume of encounters where people where people's behavior requires the use of force on the part of the officers. Next, although I think that is the end. Okay. Thank you. And I'll present this and I'll send this to all of you as soon as this meeting is over. I wanted to mention just a few other things, and then I will be quiet. We are in the midst of something that one of our city councilors called an experiment with regard to public safety. And we are working hard at fulfilling our end of that. The public safety continuity plan that was designed here in this building, pretty much as soon as last year's racial justice resolution was passed, we began looking at how we could try to meet what we knew would be an eventual increase in incident volume once the pandemic ended, with fewer and fewer resources with regard to officers, sworn officers. And we came upon the idea of bringing aboard community service officers, unarmed, unsworn officers who are able to do certain kinds of tasks, even write certain kinds of tickets, but don't really have law enforcement powers beyond municipal tickets. We are in the process of hiring them. We held a test for our first batch a few days ago. I think that we had a significant number of people who evinced interest and applied. Fewer than that actually showed up for the test. I'm not certain how we are on the results of that test, but we will be looking through it. And we are really focused on getting the 6 that are allotted for the first half of the fiscal year hired in the first half of the fiscal year. I'm very hopeful that we'll have at least a few of those trained and deployed in the first half of the fiscal year too. But if the hiring takes time, if we go from 15 applicants to 5 test takers to 1 person passing, then the role is going to be a little bit long insofar as getting them trained. It's going to be a more robust training program than we've done for the past with our CSOs. We do have 2 CSOs currently on the job. They're invaluable employees. They do a lot of really great work. But we are going to be training these in a slightly different way because we're expanding the universe of calls for service to which they can respond. So that's important to us. We are still experiencing recruitment, not recruitment, but retention issues. We are losing headcount and officers. As of April 1st, when we froze our snapshot for the sake of the budget, we were at 82 on the books and 79 effective. We're a little lower than that already. I mean, as you may know, Lieutenant Kuchar, with whom some of you operated and worked, has retired. We wish him well. Great loss to the department. I wanted to indicate that we are opening up, we're opening Ridealongs again now that the pandemic is over. In the same way that we were able to hold things in this building again, we are opening those. And I very much want this body to take advantage of that, to take advantage of ride-alongs, to take advantage of some training that we would like to offer. Some of you have gone through the Citizens Academy. That is a long time. It's a big time commitment. But we are looking to try to create some things that aren't part of that Citizens Academy that are much more about operational activities that police officers do in order for all of you to be able to experience what officers know, how they're trained, and to a certain extent, to the best of our ability, we make our training scenario-based and realistic. Training is best when it really does drive the same kinds of juices and emotions and impulses as the real world can. And I'm hopeful that we can find some training like that and that you all will be willing to join us and participate in that. I'd be honored if you were. We sent 2 of our executive supervisors, a lieutenant and one of our deputy chiefs, to some good internal investigation training. And then with regard to upcoming things, we are working on significantly increasing the number of directives that we have online. We are working on finding ways to do more with less. One of those is going to be the upcoming July 3rd celebrations. Typically on July 3rd, this agency has 68 sworn personnel in different kinds of positions. 4 of those are usually from our partner agencies at the University of Vermont and in South Burlington, but they handle things that are actually outside the city. The jug handle on Main Street and the interstate, and also Gutterson on Spear, both of which are not in Burlington. The Burlington positions are usually about 64 sworn officers. We'll have 30 or probably fewer on staff that night. So we will be focusing on a variety of different locations and then trying to figure out how we also handle the traffic impulses and the traffic flow needs of that event. But that is, I think I've probably gone enough, and that's what I've got in front of me. If there are any questions that anyone has, I'd be happy.
2 questions. First is, what is the training or the background you're looking for people who are not police, but they're going to be those positions you're hiring for?
So the background check is really not very different from a police officer background check, simply because they're still inside this building. We are governed by federal rules about who can and can't be inside this building unescorted, who can and can't have access to the Valcor system, which is the computer-aided dispatch system that is used by Burlington and soon by the entire state. It's a system that includes all the criminal history of anybody who's had criminal contact in the state that hasn't had that expunged, has a record in this Valcor system. And in order to be able to access that, there's a long list of what are called CJIS requirements. With regard to the background check as well, the one thing that's really different from the officers is we don't do a physical test for the CSOs in the same way. They do have physical requirements, but there's no PT test or physical test. We don't do an MMPI or a psychological test, and we don't issue a polygraph to them.
What are you looking for in terms of their qualifications?
Sure. So their qualifications, we want people who are going to be engaged with this community. We want people who understand that the mission of this department is to keep people safe. We prevent and respond to crime and disorder, and we do it with and for our neighbors. And if people can really show that they embrace that ethos and are interested in doing that kind of work, working with the public when the public calls about animal complaints, working with the public when we have non-injury crashes that don't need to be investigated, but a report does need to be taken, potentially working with the public when we have noise complaints and certain kinds of low-level neighbor disputes. Those individuals are who we're looking for. And in the past, the role has been one that has led to people joining the police department. A number of people who started out as CSOs have joined the police department subsequently. So we're hopeful, too, that we can be able to find some folks there. And frankly, there are also instances in which people come aboard as a CSO with perhaps some questions flagged in a background check that might not have allowed them to be a police officer, but were still enough for us to be able to allow that person to have that criminal justice information access. But then 2-3 years of exemplary performance as a CSO, those kinds of concerns that were previously raised can be significantly allayed to the point where that person can become a police officer.
Second question is, what is a directive?
A directive is the policies of this organization. So the BPD has a number of directives. I think the total number is 50-something, 55, I believe. They only go up to number 43, but there are a number that have sort of second and third parts. And they contain the directives and procedures for how we operate. The very first directive is the most important because it contains department rules. And department rules are, by that very directive, more inviolable than others. Other parts are really guidelines. They're guidelines for how officers are supposed to behave, and they have different degrees of flexibility, but they are the sort of the rails in which we operate.
Thank you.
One question.
Commissioner.
So these community service officers, are they going to have any? They're not going to have any weapons at all, not even a bottle of mace or.
So they do carry, it's not mace. We don't actually use chemical mace. We have organic OC spray or oleoresin capsicum spray, which is pepper spray. And they do carry pepper spray. They carry pepper spray primarily for animals, but they do sometimes have it for self-defense in the event of somebody who has changed the posture. They don't, however, have the ability to use force to compel someone to do something. That is, they can only use it in defense. Police officers have the ability to use force for lawful law enforcement needs, which are spelled out in the Vermont statutes.
Right.
And community service officers don't have that.
Thank you.
The test that they take, the CSOs, what is that the same test for other positions, or is there one that's targeted?
It is. It's targeted. We redesigned it for this section, for this group. I believe we ran through it with HR. We sent that test to HR? Did we? Yeah. It contains a lot of questions about the kinds of law that the CSOs deal with. So there are a couple of questions about animal code in the municipal code and what do you do if you encounter this kind of situation. So some of it is a matter of eliciting from them a sense of whether or not they are going to be people who feel like they have to, like everything has to be exactly this way, or is there some critical thinking involved in how you address a certain kind of situation? And then there's some other questions that have to do with the ability to intake information and then give it back out, because they do write reports and they have to be able to keep up with certain amounts of paperwork. So those are part of the test. I can get the test for you and let you take a look at that.
Is there a passing grade, for lack of a better term?
I believe so, but I'd have to clarify that for you. So I'll ask.
Okay, so what I'm wondering is, if folks don't get that, is there any way to work with them? I spoke with someone recently, and probably Commissioner Seguino has as well, who had said, that he's willing to work with folks on these tests, whether they're here to be an officer or CSO, but to help them if that's a challenge for them, for whatever reason. So I'm just wondering, if the test is a challenge, is there support for folks so that we can recruit? So that's not the bar for folks, that they have another bite at the apple.
Absolutely. So great question. That is something that we've done in the past for our police officer test, and it's definitely something that we need to take into account for the CSO test as well now. So yeah.
Okay, because I think that we as commissioners could probably recruit folks to help. Whether it's, tutoring isn't exactly the term, but to work one-on-one with folks in that regard. And then my last question is, well, it's two, but it's, what is the diversity of the folks who applied and took the test, and then how are we recruiting so that we get diverse applicants who represent the community?
I don't have the information about the actual number about the current applicant pool for you. I will get that for you. And with regard to recruitment, for the time being, that would be an HR question. I know that we've posted it. I know that we are looking to talk about it, certainly I'm having a meeting tomorrow, or I think it's tomorrow at AALV. I'll be bringing it up with them. I hope to start attending NPAs again now that they're live, and we'll be bringing up at those. It was my habit before the pandemic to go to every NPA meeting, and those are places where we can sort of get this idea out as well.
It escaped my mind, but I asked enough. Thank you for that.
Any further questions? Just waiting on Zoom. All right. Awesome. Thank you very much, Chief, for that report. And if you wouldn't mind sending the slides out to the commission afterwards, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you. All right, then. Moving on to agenda item 5.01, which is the data report summary. For our new commissioners, last month or two meetings ago? Last meeting? Sorry, they all blend together now. Last meeting, we had our annual report from the Innovations Office. Had a whole host of things in there, and Stephanie volunteered to summarize that report on behalf of the commission.
What is the Innovations Office?
It's what technically.
Innovation and Technology, it's a city office.
Okay, I
Not
never heard
that
of it. Thank
familiar
you.
with it.
Sorry
I think
to
it was
interrupt.
IT before, then they changed the name to this.
Thank you.
Sorry. Stephanie summarized the article on our behalf, sent it out to commissioners. We provided individually. We provided feedback to her, and she summarized it, which is posted on board docs. And I would like to essentially make this official report. So I guess is there any discussion? Any discussion people want to have on this report?
Is that a motion?
I don't think I was taking the motion yet,
Oh,
but
okay.
I was going to kind of open up the
Welcome a
floor.
motion.
I will welcome a motion at some point for sure, but I guess I was going to open the floor. People had any additional feedback to give about the data report summary, or if you wanted to say anything on behalf of this. Of the summary.
I think that I've heard back from a few commissioners with some edits to it, and just in general, that this in some ways comes out of our training with NYPD, who indicated that it would be important for the commission itself to comment on these reports and to issue reports periodically. So this was an effort to summarize these reports, which are on traffic stops, arrests, and use of force, and summarize the commission response to that.
And has the chief had an opportunity to read this?
No, this is for us, our report.
But he hasn't, even just to see what our draft report, he hasn't seen the draft report yet.
No. Oh, this memo or the annual report itself?
What you've put together as a comment.
No.
Awesome. Have you had a chance to look at the summary?
I did.
Okay, awesome. I guess on that note, I would entertain a motion to make this an official report by the police commission.
Seconded?
I'm making the motion that we accept this as an official document, seconded by Susie. Floor is open for discussion.
It would be my inclination in the future to share it with the chief ahead of time. Not to say that that's going to, that we would change it, but I think that would just be my inclination.
Right.
I think it makes sense to do that before it goes out. But I do think that, the commission itself needs to deliberate, and that was the
Right.
purpose of this, was for us to weigh in first.
Right.
And then obviously share it with the chief before this goes public.
Okay,
Yeah. Does that make sense?
it does make sense. Thank you.
All right then. So I made a motion to accept this as a police commissioner report, seconded by Susie. We've had discussions on it, and all in favor of making this an official police commissioner report, raise your hand or say aye.
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 Okay.
Aye.
I'm sorry, but I'm confused. So how is that going to be how are we taking this action but giving the chief the opportunity to provide comment before it becomes a public document?
I think that we can send it to the chief. The chief can issue his own comment in response. It wouldn't be part of this report, correct? So it would be a timing issue. Before it's posted, for example, the chief can write a response to it.
So would we be saying then that we're approving this to be made, to be shared in 2 weeks, with the chief having 2 weeks to provide comment? Or what, I just want to know logistically before I vote on it. So,
The way I'm kind of seeing this is that it's our report. I mean, we'll share, like, hey, this is what we come up with, but at the end of the day, it's our report, so.
no question, right.
So I guess I'm losing the
So
question. I guess I'm losing.
nothing changes.
If I could just add, I'm thinking of examples to give us some guidance, and you might have seen today the state auditor's report on Vermont Cares. The parties commented about it, but it was the auditor's report, and I see this in that way, that this is our report.
Right, I do. It is our report, and I'm not saying that we would make any changes, but I'm trying to understand what we just voted on with what was just said, that we would be having the chief see it before it gets made public, because it doesn't sound like that's what's happening.
Maybe you'd like to make a proposal, because
Yeah, sorry.
It's already made
Right, it is.
It's already been made
Right.
public.
Mhm. It's part of these documents. Right,
So,
right.
just throwing that out
Right.
there.
Hi, this is Commissioner Grant. So the way that I view it is that this is our report in response to what was released, and then the chief certainly can read it, and if he has a response to this particular report, he can issue that response.
Right, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that it was clear how we were proceeding. So I'm comfortable with that. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt the vote.
Quite all right. All right then. We'll vote on that one more time then. I motioned, Susie seconded, we deliberated, and so all in favor of making the data report summary, unofficial police report, police commission report, raise your hand or say aye. Aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously. Thank you for that. Moving on to agenda item 5.02, which is our annual report timeline. And generally, the commission produces a report to be delivered to city council. I don't think it's codified exactly when it's supposed to be, but traditionally it's been around June or July. And Stephanie has volunteered her time to create a report that'll kind of summarize things that we've done for the last year, complaints we've received, pretty much motions that we've kind of passed in regards to department directives and things like that. So once Stephanie has compiled that, I will send that out to the commissioners. I ask that you take a look at it and please give your feedback directly to Stephanie, just so we comport with open meeting laws. And then next meeting, hopefully, we'll have a compiled document for it. We'll be able to deliberate it here in public and then vote on that to then give to city council. I guess if anyone else has anything they want to add to that.
Right, and the goal is that you have a model and a template going forward, so it's consistent from year to year. That's great.
And just to say that at the NYPD training, we looked at some annual reports from other agencies, and so I took some of the various categories of things that they used in their reports, and that really helped shape the categories here. But if something's missing, there can be mistakes. Please don't hesitate to edit. No hard feelings at all.
Right, and part of the complication this year is taking those ideas and having to gather the data, as opposed to now we're trying to put in place data gathering as we go along so that we have commendations, we have that information all year long, so it's easier. Okay.
Actually, the last piece is commendations. I'm almost done with it. And Shannon, I've been tasking her with a lot of things. I'm really sorry to bother you. And no rush, Shannon, because we have, a few weeks to do this, so no rush whatsoever. But that piece will be blank probably when you get it, as Shannon and I kind of work through the section on commendations.
So Shireen, basically what you're saying is we're in a transition.
We are. We've
Very
learned a
much so.
lot, and so we have learned that there's data if we kept it all year, it would certainly make things easier to put together an annual report.
Because all of you are staying on for the next 6 years, right?
Awesome.
Thank you, Stephanie.
I guess if there's any further questions or comments that any of y'all have with regards to this. I'm not seeing or hearing any. That will move us on to agenda item 5.03, which is PostNicole training ideas. And it was very, very, very beneficial. 10 hours spent with them training, and I think they kind of, we've always had ideas, but they kind of, I guess, helped out showing, I guess, what's actually possible with us. And I think there's a whole plethora of things we can absolutely do, but I will kind of start this one off. I think one of the easiest things we can do and implement is rotate our monthly meetings moving forward. Traditionally, we've always held them here, but I think it would probably be in our best interest to rotate our monthly meetings per ward. Obviously, it might not work out as easy as I hoped, but I'm certainly going to reach out to the city and to see how to make this possible. In addition, this is something that Milos brought up many times before, but we can be better at outreach, and I gotta say, a lot of the ideas that NYPD threw out were ideas that Milo has brought up before, and I would like, Milo, I'd like to reach out to you and maybe kind of see if we can see what kind of outreach things we can do moving forward, if you'd be open to that. And I guess I'd be happy to hear any ideas moving forward that were presented by Nicole that you think we should do. And Stephanie, floor is yours.
So with regard to rotating monthly meetings, when I was on the school board, we tried to do this as well, and it can be a hassle. But maybe what we could do is a meeting in the north end and the south end, or in two parts of the city. Kevin had mentioned the Miller Center, so some kind of public building. So maybe we could do something like that then, rather than trying to get to each of the wards, because if you need space for executive session, that can be hard.
Right, and we have spoken with Contoy,
Right.
with Amy Bovee about, that could be our home base, if we can get it scheduled. We are working with her on that, so, because one of the things from NACOL is that it would be better if we're not meeting here within the department.
Also, I'd like the King's Youth Center. I mean, that's
The-
good.
what's that?
The King's Youth Center,
Oh, yeah,
you know.
right. It's a great idea, and maybe the Boys and Girls Club.
Do, Jabu, do you want us to look into the Miller Center for July? What would you like?
I think that's a good idea. I'm writing down Miller Center, King Street Youth Center. Because the Miller Center, that's the New North end, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's like kind of
Gosport.
south end.
I can look into that if you want.
Downtown,
And I
King's Youth Center would be.
Wait, I guess downtown?
Yeah, that would be south
I
end.
consider that
That's
downtown.
considered pretty much, that's kind of borderline south end.
And then there's, yeah.
The only place in the utter south end, which is where I live, is Champlain Elementary. That's the only place, really.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is that accessible?
Yes, they have a ramp.
Okay, I'm used to going to basketball games where it's a challenge, it's
The front door. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
I had some other thoughts around, I mean, there were a number of ideas raised around communication. This report is an example of that. But I think it's possible for us to go to NPA meetings to ask if, NPA leaders would like us to meet there. But maybe it would behoove us for the chair to designate a person on the commission to be sort of the person who is gathering those ideas and helping implement them with regard to communication.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to take that on.
Chief, one of the things that they talked about was when going to these meetings, that it's, my takeaway maybe, and correct me if you all didn't get this message, but that it would be the commission in tandem with someone from the department. And that's a good way to have, the commission understanding, coming together with the department, with officers. So I don't know if it's generally you or if sometimes you're assigning officers.
Well, I was, as I said, going to most NPA meetings, but I had also implemented a system whereby that was when I was the deputy chief. When I became chief, I set up a system where we were going to be sending area lieutenants to those NPA meetings instead. But that lasted for basically from the time I was first acting chief in late December and early January of 2019 and 2020 until March 10th when everything closed. So it didn't go very long. But the idea was to have the area lieutenants attend the NPA meetings in their respective areas.
In fact, I think I attended one in Ward 6. I thought it was great to have the area lieutenant there, so I think that would be great. There was a discussion at the NACOL training that in Denver, for example, they meet in different districts, and they will give an update on what's going on in that district.
Yes.
So maybe something to kind of personalize it to what's going on in the neighborhoods.
Yeah, they were there to be, as I was when I went. I was generally not a speaker unless I'd been prearranged to have an invite by the NPA itself. Otherwise, I was merely there to eat whatever food they were having on that given night and be available to answer questions if they came sort of organically from the audience or not.
And that was the same for the area lieutenants?
The area lieutenants had the same sort of instruction.
Seems like a great opportunity for relationship building.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would, floor still open for any commissioners, with any further kind of ideas. And I guess this is, obviously, when this agenda item ends, any ideas you kind of have moving forward, obviously, please let us know and keep it going on. I just kind of wanted to reserve this space to kind of see if anything jumped out while the trains were still fresh in our minds.
Right.
Hi, this is Commissioner Grant. I've wanted for some time, and I really would like to see us going forward, being represented at each and every NPA meeting. We should really have a segment, even if it's just a short segment, to remind people what the commission is talking about, how to access information. I just think that is a first and really simple step that we can do to start to I don't want to say reestablish, but help to clear up a lot of misconceptions about the police commission, right? We keep talking about all these misconceptions, but we are not doing as much as we could be doing outside of these particular meetings. And I really think approaching the NPAs and saying, we'd like to have like 10 minutes per meeting for, police commission updates. I think that would be really important, especially as we start to move the meetings and to really make sure that people know that they'll be in different locations within the communities. I've always been concerned about the meeting space, and I think when they mentioned that during the trainee, that really resonated with me. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Milo. I would be happy to work on like a little blurb with you that we could like disseminate to the upcoming NPA meetings if you'd like that.
Yes, and I have no problem attending them. I can attend them. I just have to, if we're okay. But I don't want to just unilaterally make a decision. Okay, I'm going to go out there and represent the police commission. I just want to know that we're all on board with the idea, and then could do a summary and say, this is what will be presented to the NPAs. Does everybody agree? And then kind of move forward and just start engaging more with those meetings. Thank you.
All right. So how about then? I think we should still get together then. Probably work out like a little template for like the blurb that would give out at these NPA meetings. Come up with a draft with that, and then we can present that to the commission next meeting and vote on that, and then kind of go forward from there. Does that make sense?
Sure, but I think we could start talking to NPAs now.
Oh no, absolutely. But I think just more like kind of like the codify, like you were saying, like what's going on here, how to access this, kind of X, Y, Z. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, and then an update on the consultants, where to find the information, because these websites have been created where people can go and look at the progress and the information that has been completed, because a lot of people don't realize that they have access to some of that information. And just disseminating that information out and reminding people, hey, we're trying to make this as transparent a process as possible, and here's where you can get the information. And maybe just also reminding people important meetings that they can listen to, and what information is covered on the meetings, and where they can access the meetings as well.
Okay, I like that. Thank you.
I want to ask a naive question. We have a lot of new American communities here, and I'm wondering if they go to NPA meetings, because I don't know. And my second question is, are we going to get materials translated for them if we're going to do this, so the whole community can take part in that?
I think between most of us, I think we have a fair amount of resources to get those stuffs translated, and yeah, that's a great idea, and I don't think it would be that difficult to do that.
I do think that.
I think it would, there is definitely not as much attendance by new Americans at the MPAs. That is true. I think in general, the MPAs is a kind of good place to start, though, in terms of just doing community engagement. Community engagement is, as the chairman said, has been like one of my number one concerns, because quite frankly, it has not happened to the degree that it should. And we just have to be starting to do something. I think it would be great to work with the REIB department. And I think that's a good point about translating materials. I know that when they were working with Talitha Consultants, they were really mindful to assist with getting translators to be on the community engagement, town halls, and things like that. So I think it'd be worth it to approach them for that assistance.
I think VRRP and also AALV would be good ways to start, because all of their caseworkers, I think we should talk to them to begin with, and they can disseminate some of that information throughout the community. But if we're looking at the whole community, I think we should start with all the way across the board. Everybody has an opportunity to get information going forward. I love the idea.
I agree. I would like to, in my mind, MPAs is one of the easiest to start. I kind of feel like we should have been more involved with that all along. But I would say, certainly not exclusively. What is the list? Let's, using this information that we got from these trainings, knowing that this is something that's important and should definitely be done, let's just, start, and certainly get a list together and look for also more community input in terms of where to put information. I know when I went to one of the town halls, I know one of our big concerns as a commission, as an example, in terms of getting information about complaints and starting to understand like how they're investigated. That, we were concentrated on that whole thing, whereas the town hall brought up all of these issues about how different people can actually submit a complaint, and there were all these issues brought up with the online process. It is not as easy as we think when we think about all the members of our community. So, those ideas, once we get that final report, I'm sure we'll be running with more engagement ideas that the community has brought forth through the consultant when they're finished with that. But yeah, there's a lot of ideas out there, and it's just like, let's start to pick the low-hanging fruit, and maybe we start to keep a list, and maybe we say, okay, here's our list, and here's the progress we're making. Just an idea, so that we're keeping track of our ideas and keeping track of when we're making particular impacts. Thank you.
Thank you.
I add one more thing. The other group I think we should pay a lot of attention to is the disability community.
And sorry.
No, I just was going to, I can provide a resource. The city did recently send out an email about language services and that kind of thing. So I can give you, I don't know exactly who the point person is, but I can find that person and give that information to you, that maybe they can certainly translate any documents or anything that you put together that you want to disseminate to the community. I think that would.
Cool. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Good to know.
A couple things. So on the NYPD issue, a couple of follow-up things. Stephanie and I talked about onboarding materials. I am happy to work with Stephanie on that, and hopefully we could have it by next month so that you two would have the benefit of it. before too long. Stephanie, are you okay with me volunteering you
Sure.
to work with me?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll do that. And then I was just looking at my notes from the training. Roll call attendance was something that came up, Chief. I don't know if that's something along with ride-alongs that we could talk about.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then just for the public, one of the things that came out of NYPD was trying to get resources for a staff member to, because Shannon's got a whole nother job she has to do other than just all of our, working with us. And so it would be getting a staff member whose job it is to work with the police commission. So that's in the works. That's something we're talking about.
Awesome. Floor still open? Yep.
So I did take a lot of notes during this meeting, and I have a whole list of ideas. And let me preface it by saying that I think it would be useful for us to think of some of these ideas and map out kind of sequentially when we would like to do them so that they actually get done. So we might think about what are the priorities that we would like to pursue in the next few months and what things could wait and so forth. So here's a few things. One is there was a discussion about trauma-informed policing, and Brian Kaur, who was past president of NYPD, who was on the training call, is somebody who said he would be willing to do that with us. So that's one kind of training. They also mentioned SAMHSA on mental health, and that might be an interesting training for us. And I think that, it's beneficial to have it if we can, if it's a half-hour thing during our public meetings, because it really benefits the public to be educated about these things as well. We've talked about refining the complaint process and getting some input from NYPD on how to do that. I think we should continue talking to NYPD. They had talked about other types of training that would be beneficial, and I think it would be great to find out what those are. United Way does crisis intervention training, so that might be something. They also recommended that we learn more about how the Burlington police are trained in a variety of areas, like de-escalation, for example, but maybe some other areas. So we as a commission could learn what some of the training is that the Burlington PD gets, for example. And we could maybe talk about what would be useful for us to have a deeper understanding of. They suggested that, I'm just going on, but just to give it to you, they suggested that we develop a list of resources to share with complainants. So we have now reaching out to complainants to acknowledge their complaint and can refer them to resources for counseling, for first call, adult crisis, and other possibilities, for example. So I think that's something that we would want to have prepared, of those things. Let's see. There was I guess a review of the accessibility of the complaint process. And perhaps these discussions with the community would help. Those are most of the things on my list, and I did want to refer to a comment that a member of the public made at our last meeting, and I'm going to try to find it here, and put this out there as something for us to think about. It was by Mary Cox. You may remember at the beginning of the meeting, she spoke regarding her own son and family's experiences with regard to the BPD and their response to mental health crisis. And she asked for a subcommittee to be formed to look at what further training would be useful to BPD officers with mental health, within a mental health context, to examine what infrastructure, including mental health workers, would be useful. And so that is an idea. I think given that the community member made that proposal, it's at least something we should consider. Maybe it's not appropriate for us. Maybe, it's a different configuration, but it would be, I think, there has been a lot of interest in mental health and alternatives to mental health. So that's my list.
Floor is yours.
I would say it's very, very important, not just in this community, but nationally. This has been a big challenge. No one can know everything, especially in high-intensity situations. So I think it would behoove us to go in that direction. And mental health challenges have arisen much more in intensity during the pandemic, and people are coming out of that. So I think that's really important. There's something else I wanted to say and forgot.
If I might just maybe ask the chief a question about this, because, I mean, her recommendation is that this be, a discussion with the BPD in terms of training around mental health. And just want to flag that CNA's staffing report is also going to include alternatives to traditional policing. So just want to get your thoughts on Mary Cox's proposal, whether you think it's a useful idea. Is this something that you think we might jointly do? Just want to hear your thoughts.
I think that Mary is a tremendous ally for this department. She participated in a program that we put together last year called, in 2019 called Vision 2020, which was designed to solicit internal and external ideas about how to revitalize the police department in a way that made those revitalizations organic, because they were the suggestions of people who were real stakeholders, and that included community members with whom we worked often, or who had had engagements or interactions with the police, as well as officers inside. And most of the recommendations from that were not able to be implemented simply because of the pandemic and the budget issues that came with the pandemic long before the budget issues associated with the idea to diminish the department through attrition. So many of those things are still there. Mary was part of a team and was a very good advocate for that. A lot of work with the community. I'm for some of those things. I think that there are limits to what it's actually going to accomplish. I think there is an underestimation of the degree to which the calls for service to which we respond are calls that other people will not respond to. They are calls that involve safety and danger, and you're not going to have social workers traipsing through the Letty Park woods in the middle of the night after an armed person trying to find that individual in order to bring him into safe custody, and then following that person into the water. And you're not going to have, and then when mental health behavior rises to criminality, when there's a component of it that is mental health based, but it nevertheless has a criminal component as well, whether that is significant property destruction that has an element of danger for others, or whether it is physical danger for others, such as assaults, etc. Those two are not situations that are going to be all that amenable to a non-law enforcement intervention. To the extent that we have situations that do not require law enforcement intervention, we are 100% behind that. And one of our great frustrations inside is that in many instances, when we request for assistance, because we recognize that the law enforcement intervention is not what's necessary once we're on scene, we do not get any assistance. Whether it's because of timing and the fact that those services are not 24/7, whether it is because those services are otherwise engaged, we are often placed in situations where we are essentially either going to leave that situation unaddressed, which is not often acceptable, or we are going to be forced to be there in a completely sort of status maintenance situation where we are not taking any action, but we're there for hours waiting for these other agencies. Or the other agencies say, get that individual to the hospital. And our method of trying to get somebody to the hospital is mostly effective with regard to talking, et cetera. But if there is a legal obligation to bring that person to a facility and a legal power to do so, then eventually talking may not be sufficient. And those instances also are ones in which, if there were healthcare abilities, mental health care abilities to actually respond to those scenes and address them in the field, we would be very, very amenable to that. To what extent is that going to further diminish the volume of our incidents? Unknown. But I really, it is 5 to 8% of our incidents that are either mental health issue incidents, like the incident itself was categorized as mental health, or that have the mental health checkbox. And 5 to 8% of them is the total. And how many of those are things that, irrespective of availability of other services, would still require a police service response? My guess is much more than half. So we're ultimately talking about maybe 2.5 to 4% of incidents that could potentially be removed from police. And we would love to have those services available. The question is whether or not other places are going to be able to bring those services up to capacity and be 24-hour services as the police are for now.
So just in response to my question, do you think it would be useful to form this committee? Or are you saying that it wouldn't be useful?
No, I'm saying I think that it is useful. I'm saying that I think there are limits to what that is going to ultimately identify as possibility.
I just want to say, in general, I've been on the commission, I think, since September, October, and the issue of mental health and policing is so deeply discussed in the community that even with the hiring constraints and many of the things, it does seem it would be a good time, an important time to bring members of the community with lived experience together to brainstorm ideas, even if we have constraints right now, to begin to think about how we might thoughtfully address this. So I would welcome, an initiative that did this, and I'm not sure how to structure it, if that would be something that you would propose to do with us jointly, or how we might approach that. But I think it would be great for us to do something like this.
In my mind, it's a partnership. I'm a social worker, so I'm also a social work professor, so I have a pretty deep understanding of these issues. And I think the most important thing is to try to partner together around this and be a learning community around this, right? Nobody owns the market on the knowledge of mental health, and no one also owns the market on all the different forces right now in our world, between the political situation, the economic situation, the pandemic. So I think it'd be really good to partner and work this to be a learning community. And that, Stephanie, I remember what I forgot before. In all these things that we're lining up, I spent a lot of time looking at the website and looking at how soon many of your terms are over, and I'm sure you're signing up for a second term. But in the unlikely event of a water landing and you don't, it'd be really good to start looking for other people now so they could partake in some of the training and the opportunities that we're all talking about. It'd be so much better, than just a short amount of time. And we all know people that might be great at this, and we have time to do it. But to get people involved from the very beginning, like it's a run-up to, a 2-year or a 3-year term, and get to know the people, go on some ride-alongs, et cetera, so that everybody gets on the ground running.
I'd like to make a proposal that the chair identify somebody or a couple of people on the commission to take a look at the list of these things and to draft a proposal about how we might sequence doing some of the items on this list, kind of map out what the next 6 months would look like, for example, and bring it back to the commission to vote on at the next meeting.
Yeah, I'd be happy to help along with that. If anyone would like to volunteer their time with that,
I could help.
sounds good. Would you email the list that we just discussed out and open to us, and we'll get together with that? Absolutely.
Can I ask how we're going to proceed with the committee to work with the chief?
No, that's an excellent idea. I mean,
Maybe it's something we could just, you perhaps could discuss with the chief and come up with some ideas. I mean, it probably is hard on the spot to figure it out.
yeah, I'd be happy with that. I'll be in touch.
He does. Yeah, he saves it, and then it's really impactful. Very careful with his
Kevin and I
words.
got to lean on you.
All right. Any further discussion on this agenda item? PostNicole training ideas. And like I said before, like just because we end this agenda item here doesn't mean that's the end of these PostNicole training ideas. I kind of feel like it may not be on the agenda, but it's something we should always be talking about, and staying on top
We
of.
can always refer back to them.
Oh, right. Absolutely. Awesome.
Yeah, the only thing that I want to throw in is the concept of the police commission having our own standalone website like I understand it would link from the city website. And then, one of the tabs could be the trainings. So the NYPD trainings and any other trainings, making a point to make sure things are recorded, whether they're Zoom or in person or a combination of both. And then just having easier access to the information. Thank you.
That's an excellent idea, Milo. Thank you. Okay. Any further discussion on this agenda item? Not seeing or hearing any. I will close this item. And next is our use of force incident report. And with that, I'll give it to Chief LeBrecq. All I ask is, do you mind just going to the podium so Town Meeting TV can get it all in? Thank you.
Would it be better if he sat?
I think they're all mic'd. I believe his is mic'd up there. So.
Thank you. All right, everybody got to see the copies. I think they were posted and sent to you as well. So I'll just
Yep, it was on board docs.
yeah, it was on board docs. So the use of force report for May, from May 1st to May 31st of 2021. The total number of incidents or calls for service that officers responded to from May 1st to May 31st was 2,001 incidents. Out of those incidents, 21 of them were use of force incidents. Out of those 21 incidents, there were 57 uses of force. Percent of use of force incidents versus total incidents was 1%. The race, gender of arrestee or subjects in the use of force incidents was as follows: black male 9, white male 11, and white female 5. First incident, and these, I don't know if I've said this in the past, but these go from like May 1st through, so we're starting at the beginning of the month, working our way through. The first incident was a agency assist to Colchester Police Department for a shooting that occurred in their town. The complainant was Colchester PD, and officers were dispatched to assist. The Colchester PD had put a BOL, which is a be on the lookout for, a motor vehicle involved in a shooting in Colchester. Burlington Police located the vehicle, and Colchester PD advised our dispatch, who advised the officers that they wanted that vehicle stopped for investigative purposes. Burlington police officers stopped the vehicle and conducted what we call a high-risk motor vehicle stop per training due to the possibility of a firearm being present in the vehicle. The subject was called out of the vehicle, and 2 officers pointed their firearms at the subject until they were taken into custody and handcuffed. Colchester PD was then notified that we had the suspect in custody. They responded with what they wanted to do. It was a white female, age 34. She was 5'6", 160 pounds. There were 2 officers involved in the use of force. 1 officer, firearm, active pointing, and verbal direction, and the other officer, firearm, active pointing, and verbal direction. There was no injury to the subject or the officer. The next incident was a disturbance with a complainant, and officers were dispatched. The caller stated that a Green Mountain Transit bus driver was having an issue with a group of 3 intoxicated subjects, and then stated the 3 males were fighting each other. Arriving officers observed 2 of the subjects speaking to Green Mountain Transit staff. One of the males yelled, I quote, everybody can read that, a swear word, stepped forward aggressively towards the bus driver. The officer feared that the male was going to assault the bus driver and stepped in between them and pushed the subject back with 2 hands and stated, "Get back." The subject complied. It was a black male, age 30, 5'8", 160 pounds. 1 officer was involved. He used empty hand controls, which was the push, and verbal direction. The subject was not injured, and the officer was not injured. The next was a arrest for a DUI. It was a call. There was a complainant that called in, and officers were dispatched to the area. Officers responded to multiple 911 calls for a motor vehicle involved in a crash. An operator of one of the vehicles was arrested for suspicion of operating a motor vehicle under the influence. The subject was taken into custody without incident. During transport to the Burlington Police Department, the arrestee became verbally abusive towards the officer and was manipulating his handcuffed hands behind his back. Upon arrival at the station, the officer, concerned about the aggressive behavior of the arrestee and the manipulation of the handcuffs, had two other officers stand by while he removed the arrestee's handcuffs. One handcuff was removed, but the arrestee refused to follow the officer's verbal direction to place his uncuffed hand on his head. The arrestee attempted to turn and face the officer. At that juncture, the officer decided to place the arrestee back into handcuffs to prevent an assault. The arrestee violently resisted these efforts. All three officers were needed to place the male back into handcuffs using a wrist lock and non-compliant handcuffing. It was a white male, age 35, 5'7", 172 pounds. There were three officers, and they all basically used a rear wrist lock trying to get the subject back into handcuffs.
Sorry,
The
just to
officer,
correct, can you describe what a wrist lock is?
not without physically demonstrating it.
Okay.
Well, it would be your arm back behind like this and just
Uh-huh.
moving the wrist up like this,
I
like
see.
locking the wrist. Because when the handcuffs go on, it's hard because I'm not turned around, but like this, the handcuffs go on there and there. So that's
Got
kind of
it.
the position of your wrist.
Okay.
Very low level of force. The arrestee was uninjured by the use of force, but injuries, he did have injuries that were from the motor vehicle crash and IV drug use. Next one was a threats and harassment call. Officer generated complaint, so the officer himself observed it. While assisting another officer in a separate investigation, the officer was approached by a male subject known to officers. The subject made a gesture with his hand as a gun and pulling a trigger. The officer knew the subject to do this whenever he observed this officer. The officer attempted to pull out onto the road, but traffic held him up and they were pulling out of a parking lot. The male ran up and struck the driver's side door and window with his hands. The subject then yelled for the officer to step out of the cruiser and fight him. The officer drew his CEW, which is also known as a taser. In the event he did have to exit his vehicle, but did not point it at the subject. The officer was able to pull out onto the roadway and leave the scene without further interaction with the male. So black male, age 26, 5'10", 180 pounds. There was one officer involved in the use of force. He did display his controlled electronic weapon. The officer was uninjured and the subject was uninjured. The next one is an arrest operating without owner's consent, which in Vermont is the equivalent of stealing a car. Violations of conditions of release. There was a complainant that called the PD and officers were dispatched. The complainant called after their car was stolen when they ran into a store leaving the keys in the car. An officer located the motor vehicle and conducted a high-risk motor vehicle stop per training. While calling out the operator, who was also the arrestee, officers pointed their firearms at the arrestee. As the arrestee was called from the stolen vehicle back to the officers, the arrestee was taken into custody without incident. The arrestee was a white female, age 41, 5'5", 160 pounds. There were three officers involved. Two officers' firearms were pointed. One officer's firearm was displayed. Neither the officer or the arrestee were injured in the incident. The next is for an arrest, felony burglary, simple assault, and possession of.
I'm sorry. I have a quick question about the incident. Did I hear you correctly? And you said that the owner of the car left their keys in it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. I
No,
just
no.
wanted to verify that.
Yeah, they left their keys. I think it was running too. The next one is an arrest for a felony burglary, simple assault, and possession of cocaine. There was a complainant that called and officers were dispatched. Excuse me. The complainant called dispatch stating two unknown males had broken into his apartment and assaulted him, punching him in the face. The caller described them as two black males, early 20s, both wearing shorts, one in a gray hoodie and the other in a black hoodie. Officers responded to the area and a canine track was started and tracked to a motor vehicle parked nearby with two males matching the description of the suspects. As officers approached the vehicle, they observed a third male running towards the vehicle. Upon seeing the police approaching the car, the male that was running towards the vehicle veered off into the tree line and out of sight of the officers. The male passenger of the car was observed reaching into the area of the center console of the vehicle. Officers feared he was reaching for a weapon, drew their firearms. That male also did not follow commands from officers at first, but officers were able to talk to him and get him to comply. When he exited, the officers noted that he was highly intoxicated. The officers were able to safely call the two males from the vehicle, place them in handcuffs without further incident. The third male who ran from the officers was located underneath a parked vehicle near the first vehicle. Officer could see an object in his hand but could not make out exactly what it was. Officers drew and pointed their firearms at the male and gave him verbal commands to exit from underneath the vehicle. An officer was able to grasp his left arm and help the male exit from under the vehicle, where he was placed in handcuffs. The object in his hand was found to be a cell phone. The male was identified by the complainant as the one who assaulted him. There were 3 black males involved. The first was age 20, 5'8", 180 pounds. The second was a black male, age 19, 5'10", 130 pounds. And the third was a black male, age 19, 5'5", 128 pounds. There were 4 officers involved in uses of force. Officer 1 used empty hand controls and verbal commands. Officer 2, firearm pointed and empty hand controls. Officer 3, firearm pointed, and Officer 4, firearm displayed, and their taser or controlled electronic weapon was also displayed. The officers were uninjured, the subjects were uninjured, but the intoxicated male was transported to the medical center due to his high level of intoxication. The next is a robbery, simple assault on a police officer. There was a complainant and officer that called dispatch, and officers were dispatched to the call. The complainant/employee of a convenience store called stating a teenage male was loitering in the store, acting suspiciously. He displayed a mallet and callers stated something bad, quote, something bad is going to happen. A knife was observed as well. The male asked them for vape pens, and staff, in fear, handed him a large quantity, a value of $808 worth. The male placed them into a bag he brought into the store and left the store without paying for them. While officers canvassed the area for the male, a woman called dispatch and reported that her son had come home with a bag full of vapes he had stolen from a convenience store. The 2 officers responded and met with the mother before making contact with the juvenile. She reported that her son had left the house with a mallet and detachable scissors and then had come home with a bag full of vapes. The officers accompanied the mother up a narrow, steep flight of stairs to the juvenile's bedroom. For more than 10 minutes, the officer and mother negotiated with the juvenile to turn over the property. While officers stood back, the mother recovered an amount of stolen property from a drawer and then attempted to recover one last item from the juvenile's person. The juvenile resisted his mother's attempts. The 2 officers then approached. One held the juvenile while the other opened the juvenile's hand and removed the property. The 2 officers disengaged, at which point the juvenile assaulted the 2 officers with his fists. The officers placed the juvenile in handcuffs. The juvenile was non-compliant and experienced a behavioral emergency, including screaming, biting, spitting, violently struggling. The outburst prevented the officers from being able to escort him from the home and ultimately continued for approximately 20 minutes. A supervisor was called and arrived and attempted to de-escalate the juvenile but was unsuccessful. A neighbor who mentors the juvenile arrived and attempted to calm the juvenile but was unsuccessful. The Burlington Fire Department was called and, in consultation with the mother and under a physician's order, employed a medical intervention to calm the juvenile and then transported him to the University of Vermont emergency room. The criminal case has right now been referred to the Alternative Justice, or CJC. So black male, age 14, 5 foot tall, 230 pounds. There were 2 officers involved. Officer 1 used empty hand controls, verbal commands. Officer 2, empty hand control and verbal commands. Officers were uninjured. Subject was uninjured, paramedic intervention, and transport to the University of Vermont emergency room. The next is a felony unlawful trespass and a mental health call. The complainant, there was a call, and officers to dispatch, and officers were dispatched to it. The complainant, after waking up at 5:49 a.m. to a completely naked male standing over her as she was in bed, the male had left the residence at the time of her call. Approximately 2 minutes after her call, officers located the subject nearby and took him into custody, compliantly handcuffing him without incident. While investigating the incident, a second officer remained with the suspect. Due to his lack of clothes and the air temperature, the officer attempted to get the male to sit in the back of the cruiser to stay warm. The male was uncommunicative and sat down on the ground. While on the ground, the suspect swayed back and forth. Knowing that it is harder to keep your balance even seated while handcuffed, the officer placed his hands on the suspect's shoulder to prevent him from falling over and injuring himself. The suspect eventually relaxed and leaned back against the officer's shins. The officer was able to determine through their investigation, officers were able to determine through their investigation the suspect's name and that he was autistic. The officers spoke with the complainant, explained the situation. The subject was not charged and he was released to family members. It was a white male, age 16, 6 foot tall, 150 pounds. There was 1 officer involved in the use of force with empty hand controls. That was the hands on the shoulder. The officers were uninjured and the subject was uninjured. The The next one is a felony unlawful mischief, which is a vandalism. This was an officer initiated, so the officer observed the crime. A BPD officer in the Uniform Bureau parking lot observed a male walk through the lot, drop a backpack in front of her cruiser, bend down towards where the backpack dropped. The officer was sitting in her vehicle. The officer exited their vehicle and asked the male, is there something I can help you with? The male turned towards her with an object in his hand. The officer immediately created distance, fearing a weapon in his hand, and called for more units. The officer then observed the arrestee throw a large rock, roughly a cantaloupe-sized, into multiple police cruiser windshields. The officer drew her controlled electronic weapon and gave the arrestee orders to drop the rock and get on the ground. The rock ended up on the ground, so the officer did not deploy her controlled electronic weapon. 2 other officers arrived. One officer drew his firearm, provided lethal cover per training. The other officer drew his taser. After a third command, the arrestee got onto his knees and was taken into custody without further incident. It was a black male, age 32, 5'8", 200 pounds. There were 3 officers involved. Officer 1 displayed their taser and warned. The second officer pointed their firearm, and the third officer displayed their taser and also was warned. The officers weren't injured, and the arrestee was uninjured. The next is an arrest for impeding a public officer. It came in as a medical call, and officers were dispatched. Burlington police officers were performing CPR on a male at an address, waiting for the Burlington Fire Department to arrive. The arrestee was also on scene in the apartment and initially gave a false name, claimed that he lived there, and falsely claimed to be the son of the medical subject. The male was disrupted while BPD officers performed CPR on the male and continued to interfere with the fire department while they attempted to perform life-saving measures. The medical subject did not survive and was declared deceased by the Burlington Fire Department. Burlington police officers then took over the scene and began to conduct a death investigation. The arrestee continued to interfere with the officer's investigation and refused to answer any questions. The arrestee grew more combative, at one point attempting to take evidence from an officer's hand, and refused to leave when asked multiple times to do so. Officers attempted to compliantly walk the arrestee out of the residence. The arrestee actively resisted, dropping his weight to the ground, and refused to comply with orders, tucking his arms in, not placing his hands behind his back. And it took 5 officers to place him in handcuffs and take him into custody. It was a white male, age 35, 6 feet tall, 185 pounds. There were 5 officers involved in the use of force. Other force held the legs down of the subject. Officer 2, empty hand controls. Officer 2 and 3, empty hand controls and armbar takedown. Officer 4, other force used. Officer 5, empty hand controls and verbal commands. Neither the officer or the arrestees were injured. The next is a robbery. There was a complainant in the call dispatch, and officers were dispatched to the call. Complainant working at a convenience store called stating he was robbed at knife point by a male subject. The first arriving officer observed a motor vehicle parked in the lot facing the exit. The officer activated their blue lights, pulled up behind the vehicle. Because a weapon was reported to be involved, the officer drew his firearm and waited for more officers before making contact with the operator. 2 more officers arrived on scene. They exited their cruisers and set up a high-risk motor vehicle stop. The suspect vehicle drove towards the exit. Officers yelled for the vehicle to stop with their firearms pointed at the vehicle. The vehicle stopped, and a female operator was safely removed from the vehicle and detained. Another officer observed a male on the street near the store and went out with him. Because of the presence of a weapon in the robbery, the officer gave orders to walk backwards towards him. The officer could hear the male mumbling to himself and speaking nonsensically. The officer drew his firearm and pointed at the male as he had the male move backwards towards him. A second officer arrived on scene and placed the male in handcuffs. The officer holstered his firearm once the male was in custody. The first was a white female. She was age 25, 5 foot tall, 180 pounds. The second use of force was a white male, age 35, 6'2", 160 pounds. 3 officers were involved. Officer 1, firearm pointed. Officer 2, firearm displayed. Officer 3, firearm pointed. Neither of the officers or the subjects were injured. The next one is a felony aggravated assault, leaving the scene of an accident, gross negligent operation of a motor vehicle. This was called in to dispatch from complainants, and officers were dispatched to the call. Complainant called stating his vehicle was struck by another vehicle and the operator drove off. A separate officer was in a parking garage investigating a separate incident when he observed the arrestee, who he knows through prior law enforcement encounters, driving the vehicle that was wanted for leaving the scene of the accident, what the call was for. The arrestee is well known to law enforcement due to his enormous size, mixed martial art training, violent incidents, and mental health issues. The officer stopped the arrestee and attempted to speak with him. The arrestee exited his vehicle and started to approach the officer. The officer ordered the arrestee to stop and asked if he had any weapons on him, as he was known to carry a knife. The arrestee stated he had a tool. When asked what the tool was, the arrestee stated it was a sharp tool. The officer told him not to touch it, and he complied. The officer informed the male that he was under arrest for aggravated assault and leaving the scene of an accident. The aggravated assault was from a separate complaint. The officer ordered him to his knees, and the arrestee did not comply. A second officer arrived on scene and drew his taser and pointed it at the arrestee. After several more commands, the arrestee complied and was taken into custody without further incident. The male is a white male, age 33. He's 6'6", 320 pounds. There was one officer involved that used force, the officer that pulled his taser out and pointed at the subject. Neither the officer or the arrestee were injured. The next is a incapacitated subject in protective custody. This was called in, there's a complaint that called into dispatch, and officers were dispatched to the call. Complainant called stating there was a female passed out on the sidewalk. The subject is well known to BPD officers with an extensive number of law enforcement encounters and is known to be assaultive towards law enforcement officers. The female was standing upon arrival. The officer observed that she was incapacitated, which is a danger to herself or others. The officers explained to the female that she was not under arrest but being placed in protective custody. The female actively resisted being taken into protective custody. The officer brought her to the ground and waited for a second officer to arrive to safely complete taking her into custody. The second officer had to pull the female's arm out from under her to get her into handcuffs. Due to her high-level intoxication, she was transported to the University of Vermont emergency room to be medically screened. It's a white female, age 52, 5'2", 144 pounds. There were two officers involved in the use of force. Officer 1 used verbal direction, empty hand controls, an armbar takedown. Officer 2 used other techniques, which is called a hidden arm technique of pulling someone's arm out from underneath them when they're actively resisting, not allowing you to pull the arm out. The officers were uninjured, and the arrestee was also, sorry, I shouldn't be arrestee, the subject was uninjured. I think we're halfway through. Drink water. Thank you. The next is a suspicious call. There was a complaint who called dispatch. Officers were dispatched to the call. The complaint stated that there was an open door at his neighbor's house. Upon arrival, officers went to the open door, knocked, announced himself as police. No one responded after several attempts. Other officers arrived and set up a perimeter and prepared to enter the residence to do a protective sweep. The officer had his weapon out and displayed. The officer observed a male moving inside the residence and held his firearm at the high ready position, which would be like this, we can see, and advised the male to show his hands. The male complied with the officer's request and identified himself as a resident of the property. The officer holstered his firearm, made contact with the male who confirmed to be the resident. He had been out in his backyard and did not hear officers when they were at the front yelling police. It's a white male, age 39. He's 5'7", 130 pounds. One officer is involved in the use of force, verbal direction, and firearm displayed. Neither the officer or the subject were injured. The next is a felony aggravated assault. This is officer initiated. Officers observed two males, one pursuing the other, so the officer observed one male chasing another. The pursuing male appeared to have a weapon in his hand. The officer aired what he observed, and there was a weapon involved. The officer exited his cruiser and pursued the two males. After a brief foot pursuit, the officer drew his firearm and identified himself as a police officer and ordered them both to stop. The pursuing male stopped and complied. The second male continued to run. The officer ordered the stopped male to drop the weapon and then observed it was a large silver spatula. The one who dropped the spatula, had the tip jar stolen from his place of business by the still running male and had pursued him with a spatula in his hand. Hearing the broadcast on the radio, a second officer was able to get in front of the still running male. Due to the mention of a weapon, the officer drew his firearm and pointed it at the male and ordered him to stop. The male complied but held his hand behind his back. The officer ordered the male to show his hand. The male complied, revealing an empty hand. The officer holstered his firearm. The male began to walk aggressively toward the officer, displaying pre-assaultive clues. He's taking off his shirt, throwing it down, removing a necklace and wrapping it around his knuckles and pacing back and forth. The officer then drew and displayed his taser. A second officer arrived, and the two officers were able to take the arrestee into custody without further incident. While at the Burlington Police Department, the male started to fight with two officers while they were taking him out of handcuffs. The officers had to place his arms back behind his back to apply the handcuffs again, as it was deemed too dangerous to have him out of handcuffs. The arrestee, the one that was back at the station, was a white male, age 38, 6'1", 160 pounds. The male with a spatula was a white male, age 30, 5'9", 150 pounds. There were 3 officers involved. Officer 1 had his firearm pointed and used verbal commands. Officer 2 had his firearm displayed, his taser displayed, and used empty hand controls, and Officer 3 used empty hand controls. Neither officer, the arrestee, or the subject were injured. The next is an arrest for a DUI. There was a complaint that called, and officers were dispatched. Complaint called after observing a motor vehicle crash into several dumpsters. The caller was able to give a license plate number, vehicle description, street, and direction of travel. The caller also stated there was a female passed out in the passenger seat. The officers caught up to the vehicle after it crashed a second time, disabling the vehicle. The first officer on scene was pointed towards the arrestee by a witness. The arrestee attempted to pick up his passed out passenger off the ground and leave, and the officer attempted to stop him. The officer then struggled with the male. A second responding officer arrived on scene and assisted the first officer in bringing the male to the ground to control him. Once on the ground, the male was placed in handcuffs and taken into custody without further incident. It was a black male, age 21, 6'6", 190 pounds. There were 2 officers involved in the use of force, empty hand controls, and an arm bar takedown for the first male, empty hand controls, arm bar takedown, and ground cuffing for officer number 2. Neither officer nor the arrestee were injured. The next is a felony vandalism, simple assault with bodily fluids on a police officer, and violation of court orders. There were numerous complaints on this one, called into the PD, and officers were dispatched. Multiple complaints called regarding vandalism to damaged vehicles. Officers located over 20 vehicles that had been damaged and a person of interest who was identified. This is the same male who had damaged the windshield of the 6 BPD cruisers earlier in the month. The arrestee was located, taken into custody, and transported to the Burlington Police Department. When the arrestee was removed from the cruiser in the Sallyport, he lunged at an assisting officer and spat a large amount of mucus directly into her eyes. The arrestee shouted, "You got what you," quote, "you got what you deserved, you C-word," and, quote, "I'll spit on her again if she touches me." If you decide to place it was decided to place a spit hood on the arrestee. The officer who had been spit on had to brace the struggling arrestee up against the cruiser so the spit hood could be placed on him. The arrestee was a black male, age 32, 5'8", 200 pounds. There was one officer, Officer 1, other force used. She placed her hand on the back to brace him, and his arm to brace him up against the vehicle while the spit hood was put on. The arrestee was uninjured. The officer was injured and transported to the University of Vermont Medical Center emergency room. The next is a suicidal female and a disturbance. There were multiple, there's a complaint called dispatch, and officers were sent to the call. Multiple complaints called about female fighting with a male and or possibly cutting herself. Upon arrival, first officer could hear a female screaming behind a fence. Due to the nature of the call and the possibility of a weapon, the officer drew his firearm. Officers made contact with the subject and observed no weapon present. Officer holstered his firearm without pointing it at the subject. Officer observed only one old cut healing on the subject. She refused to speak to the officers, telling them to leave, and refused all services that were offered by the officer. It was a white female, age 30, 5'1", 130 pounds. There was one officer involved, firearm displayed, not pointed. The officer was uninjured, and the subject was uninjured. The next is a domestic disturbance. There was a complaint that called, and officers were sent to the call. Complainant called stating they could hear a physical domestic with a female crying and yelling, quote, "Get off me." The arriving officer could hear loud screaming and crying from a male and female in the apartment. Officers attempted to make contact, but no one would come to the door. The officer called out for the male to open the door. A male partially opened the door but would not show his hands. The officer, fearing the male had a weapon, and with the female still yelling, drew his firearm and pointed at the male, telling the male to step out into the hallway. The male refused and shut the door. The male abruptly opened the door and started screaming at the officer. The officer holstered his firearm and spoke with the male, which appeared to calm him down. The officer was able to establish a rapport with the male and finally was allowed into the apartment. Entering the apartment, the officer observed a large butcher knife next to the door on a desk. The officers were able to discern that no crime had been committed and that was a mental health issue. There was a white male, age 29, 5'9", 172 pounds. There was one officer involved in the use of force, firearm pointed. Neither the officer or the arrestee were injured. Two more. This is an arrest, assault on a healthcare worker and a mental health call. This was officer initiated. Excuse me. Officers had brought an arrestee to the University emergency room on a warrant for an emergency mental health evaluation. The arrestee is well known to law enforcement due to his enormous size, mixed martial art training, violent incidents, and mental health issues. The arrestee was placed in a room with a nurse and security guard standing outside. The officers were a short distance away from the security guard, from the room, and heard the sounds of a disturbance. Upon entering the room, they found the nurse and the security guard both had been assaulted and were slightly incapacitated. All 4 officers knowing the arrestee drew their tasers. 1 officer gave verbal commands to the arrestee to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The arrestee complied. 2 officers holstered their tasers and handcuffed the arrestee. White male, age 33, 6'6", 320 pounds. There are 4 officers involved in the use of force. Officer 1 had their taser pointed and gave verbal commands. The other 3 officers all had their tasers pointed. The officers were uninjured and the arrestee was uninjured. The last is an arrest for a simple assault. There was a complainant that called and officers responded. We had numerous 911 calls. Complainant stated he was assaulted by the arrestee who kicked him, choked him, and held a gun to his head. The victim knew the arrestee and shared this information with officers. An officer circulating the area located the arrestee hiding behind a bush nearby. 2 other officers arrived on scene. Based on the information regarding a firearm, the officers drew their firearms. The first officer made contact with the arrestee and had him remove his hands from his pockets and lay prone on the ground. The arrestee complied. 1 officer moved behind the bush and found the arrestee prone with his hands above his head. The officer observed the male did not have a weapon in his hands and holstered her weapon. The last approaching officer holstered her weapon, seeing the arrestee on the ground. 1 officer remained with his firearm out to provide cover until the male could be handcuffed and searched. Once the officer handcuffed the arrestee without incident, no firearm was located on the male, nor in the area where the male had been hiding. It was a white male, after all that, I missed the final one. I believe he was in his mid-20s or early 30s. 5'10", 170 pounds. 3 officers were involved. All 3 of them displayed their firearm. The officer and arrestee were uninjured. Thank you for sitting through that.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
All right. That closes that agenda item. The next agenda item is 7.01, which is commendations that have been received. So with that, I give the floor to Shannon. You might need to just get on. Yeah, perfect.
Might I make a comment?
Of course.
From Commissioner Comerford was a question about why is this verbally given and not just a written report? I think it was, partly we had requested monthly reports, and we asked for, kind of a table to be filled out, but the chiefs believed that context was important, and this would give us the opportunity to ask any questions about it. So theoretically, we could just read it. It does seem really tedious. I don't know how it feels for DC Lebrecht, but I think it does feel a little bit tedious, but maybe that's something to talk about in the future.
Good idea.
I'll have lots of questions since I'm so new, so bear with me, please.
Quite all right. We still have questions going forward. All right then. So yes, 7.01, which is commendations.
Okay, I just have 2 to share with you. One was an email received from Street Outreach, who is a partner in the community, commending an officer that responded to a mental health call at a bus station. And upon Street Outreach's arrival, the officer was building rapport with the woman and de-escalating her. And she felt the need to share how well the officer handled that call, and that Street Outreach said that both who responded were impressed with how he handled the very challenging situation. And then the second one was a voicemail I received from a mother to our domestic violence officer, and she expressed her gratitude to him in helping her daughter in an extremely unfortunate and sad situation. And so she called to give thanks, and that voicemail was passed on to the officer and the chiefs as well.
Thank you for that.
Shannon, do you mind if I ask it? How do you track these? Do you keep track of commendations?
I do now.
Okay. So we will know that they, so, okay, good.
Yeah, I do now.
Excellent, thank you. So they'll be tracked in terms of, so we can include that information in what we're.
Yes, that was something that Commissioner Seguino and I were going to work together on. I'm going to go back from the year because it was just something that was received, whether it was various emails or phone calls, and we just kind of read them and put them in their files and shared them with them. And then, of course, their lieutenants and deputy chiefs as well are notified. But going forward, I will be keeping a list for y'all.
How many come in through the website, the portal, where there's an ability to make commendations that way?
I would.
Zero?
I don't necessarily
Zero.
see all of them that come through. Sometimes there's one or two maybe that have.
So we have a number of ways of tracking commendations. So commendations are issued by supervisors for officer conduct, and they are also offered by members of the public who have been affected by police interactions. Some of them come through the portal, and I would say two to three a month, and those are distributed. Some of them come to Sarah Trieb, some of them come directly to me. I have spoken with our tech about having them directed to the two of you the same way that citizen complaints are, and we are going to do that. We just have to make sure that not everything that comes in, that portal also, the same portal, different entry point, but the same portal also sends us drug tips, et cetera. I'm probably not going to have those sent to you guys, but those are things that, so I'm trying to figure out how we can make certain that the right pieces go. But that is something I spoke with our new network administrator a few days ago, late last week. We bring them in. I make certain to reach out to officers that have either gotten commendations from supervisors or from the public. I talk to the officers about it. I also ask Shannon to place them in the officer's employment folder, their personnel folder, and then their performance file, which is held on the other side of the building in USB, often gets a copy as well. And then those are there to factor into, evaluations, they factor in to a certain extent to disciplinary discussions, and they factor in to a certain extent for promotions as well. Although we are certainly they factor into promotions that are lateral type promotions or movement within, say, to the detective unit. But for supervisory promotions, we have tried to make that process as specific to the process itself, as opposed to having these other things. So it's a balance between making certain that we're trying to be as fair as possible with regard to how did you perform on this process? Did you study for the test? Did you answer the interview questions well? And various members of this commission have been members of promotions processes. But also having these kinds of commendations and notes from the public incorporated. I think they do, unfortunately right now, they do a good job as our personnel look at other employment, and they're in their personnel folders, and those are nice things to take to prospective new employers. But we do keep them all, and we do track them. We just don't have a single database in which we've kept track of them the same way as we do as complaints, but we will.
It's easily turnable over.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Do you feed them back to the community with de-identifying them in any way?
I do get. I often respond to the person who gave the commendation, if that's what you mean. If you mean telling the public that so and so got a commendation, or
Some way to de-identify everybody involved, but just to sort of put out to the community that it's not just complaints you're getting, you're also
Sure.
getting affirmations.
well, so that is the purpose of having it read here in the police commission meeting. The fact is that I've thought about it doing it on social media. I'm forced to anonymize it in such a way, both for the officer and for the person who issued it, that it almost renders it somewhat toothless. But I'd be really happy to hear ideas about what I've missed that could make that work better.
And I do believe it's new that you'll be including like kind of a synopsis or a snapshot or something in the police commission's annual report. So that may be, while it's not inclusive of every single commendation, at least it's a little bit more than has been done in the past, for sure.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Moving on to the next agenda item, it is 8.01, which is commissioner updates and comments. This is kind of a time in the meeting where if you have kind of anything you want to bring up, say, share to the public, you have the floor. So, yeah.
I got a question. This is for the chief. So I'm interested in doing some of these drive-alongs. So how do I go about that? Who do I reach out to? Do I reach out to Shannon or yourself?
Shannon or me, but they're run, Sarah Trieb, who is the assistant to the officer in charge. She's the one who keeps track of them and will tell you what you need to do to get, to have one done.
Okay.
And actually, if I may, Mr. Chair, there was, there's an officer here who actually had I think he'd intended to come to public comment, but I think they got diverted by operational stuff, but had an offer about the ride-along. So
Okay, cool.
I don't, if I may.
Welcome to use the podium and let us know. Thank you. And then I think I saw Mila unmute, so the floor is yours after that.
Hello, Commission. My name is Joseph Coro. I'm the Vice President of the Burlington Police Officers Association. I just wanted to pass along to all of you that if you are interested in doing ride-alongs, that the Executive Board would like you to ride along with us. If it comes on a day that I'm not working, if it works for the chief and for the officers working that day, I'll come in, put on a uniform, we can do a ride-along. I'm happy to come in at night, work with you guys. I'd like you to see a good amount of what we do. I would recommend 5 to 10 ride-alongs at various times of the night and day. Probably Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays would be my recommended times for you to actually see kind of when we're most busy and what we're dealing with on a daily basis. So I'm here tonight, and I'm going to be around, and I also just want to extend from the BPOA, we'd be happy to meet with you and actually talk a little more, in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mila, I see you're unmuted. Floor is yours if you'd like.
Yes, thank you. So can we be emailed contact information for scheduling ride-alongs? It's definitely something that I would like to do. I was able to do one when I was on the committee to review policing policies, but not able to do any because I joined the commission during COVID. So I would definitely like to do that. And I guess I want to be clear about the scheduling, because when I was on the committee to review policing policies, I wanted to do more than one, but I wasn't allowed to. So I guess who would ever be handling the scheduling, as long as they know that, hey, yes, we'll allow police commissioners to do more than one. I think at the time it was something like, oh, you could only do one like every 6 months or something like that. And even though I was on the committee, I wasn't allowed to do more. So I would definitely be interested in doing more. I'm also interested in roll calls, like what if we could be sent information on how we could schedule to attend those as well.
I was just gonna say, I'll send the commission's, everyone's Sarah's contact information, and the chief and her have been in discussion about providing times and slots and multiple times for the commission to participate in ride-alongs. Regarding roll calls, I have to leave that to the chief to chat about.
Awesome.
And since we don't have email addresses from the department at this point, should I give you my other email?
So I have the one that
You have the one
Lori
before.
emailed, if
Okay.
that is.
That's
and
good.
I
That's
do have
good.
another point too afterwards about that, but I'll just use that one for now to.
Perfect.
It'll just come separate, but there is a group, commission group email, so you can email like police commission at, or commission at, or police commission at, don't quote me on that. And then it goes to goes to everyone, but until I don't want to put your private email on that for distribution yet.
Thank you.
Once you get your city email, that will be up and running, but yeah, I'll use your personal for now.
And we can sit in the front of the cruiser, right? Before we get too far into these ride-alongs.
Yes.
I'm gonna ask too many questions, they're gonna put me in the back.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing that, upcoming. And I was gonna say, floor's still open, so floor's yours, Mila.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I would be interested in meeting with the Officers Association, so please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Awesome. Any further commissioner comments or updates?
I have a protocol question. So should we wait, should I wait until you see me and I put my hand up, or should I just talk if you're not looking at me?
I'm very easygoing, so I generally do a good job of seeing you, but always, yeah, if I'm like, floor's yours for update or comment, feel free to jump in.
I don't want to be disrespectful.
I understand. I appreciate that. Thank you. Awesome.
Mr. Chair, I just have a couple of clerical issues. I received your signed that you returned to Lori.
Yeah.
Kevin. And then Susie, I have yours here. I don't know if you returned it to Lori or not, but
I did.
printed. Okay, you did?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I didn't see a copy, and so I printed one off. If you hadn't done it yet, then I was just gonna ask for your signature, but I guess we're good.
Awesome. Any further commissioner updates or comments? Not hearing any. Moves us on to agenda 9.01, which is next meeting agenda items. I have two absolutes and some things that I might add as I get more feedback information from. On absolute will be the discussion of the annual report that will be circulated amongst us shortly, and an MPA outreach template. And I'm happy to include anything if anyone has anything on the top of their heads now. But as always, please email me throughout the month as agenda items come up to you and you think needs to be discussed and put on. Or anybody else.
The schedule, sort of the work plan that you and
Yes.
Susie are going to work on?
Sorry, thank you.
We may have that oversight policy, but I don't know that we want to add it yet, right? Because we're talking
Oh,
about
right.
revising it, we should have a draft by then.
Uh-huh.
So I guess you could, I have to send you the exact wording, but it's revising the oversight policy, but I don't have in mind the actual name of the policy at the moment.
All right.
And then, I don't know that we have to put on the agenda the onboarding, but it might make me actually work with you on it, but we don't have to put it on there, just hold me to it, Steph.
Okay, I'll hold you to it.
I'll write it down and we can always amend it, right?
Can we add one other item? And again, this is one that Shireen knows about. Alan Matson had contacted us around recruitment issues. And although we're not recruiting officers, we are recruiting CSOs. And so I think it would be useful to put that on the agenda.
Shereen, it might be actually helpful to put it on the agenda, the orientation, so that we're setting a precedent going forward that we're going to continue to do this with new people. Maybe you've always done it, I don't know, but
No, we haven't, that's not a
That
bad
might-
idea.
that might be good.
One question. Are you okay with continuing as chair? We shouldn't presume that.
I'm happy as
Be
long as y'all are happy,
grateful.
but
Okay. I just didn't want to presume. It's a
No.
lot of work, and you do a great job. so
I
thank you.
understand. Thank you. If y'all are happy with the job I'm doing, I'm happy to continue, but yeah.
Great. And if anyone wants to serve as chair, as vice chair, I don't feel strongly that I have to be sitting in this position, so,
You're doing great.
I'm very
doing
impressed,
great doing
actually.
this, right?
Jeb, but one more item is perhaps an update on the discussion with the chief around a mental health subcommittee.
Landon, when is your last meeting with us?
It's the next month.
So you will be here?
Yeah, I'm meeting my replacement Thursday.
Oh. Great.
How long have you been on the commission?
It's a good question. Longer than I can remember.
More than 2 years, right?
Oh, over 3 years. They're 3 years almost, exactly, yeah.
It's an amazing contribution.
Awesome. All right. I have these written down. Sweet. We do require executive session to this time around. I was gonna say, what time is it? It's 8:07. I was gonna say recess for about 10 minutes, so I can use the bathrooms, things like that. Yada yada yada. And just so the public knows that once we exit executive session, our meeting will be done. There'll be no actionable items to be made. So, yeah. With that, yeah. Recess for 10 minutes, and we'll
We
see.
have to do our motions. Okay. The,
Oh, yeah, that's right. See, I've been doing this for 2 years, and I still forget procedural things. So with that, I motion that we enter into executive session to discuss citizen complaints and discipline.
second.
Any discussion? Not hearing any. All in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
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 That passes unanimously. And it is 8:08. I say we motion recess for 10 minutes. I'll see everybody back in here, or I'll see the commission in here at 8:18.
But we will do it in the roll call room, which allows you to disassemble your stuff.
Very true. Okay. All right, then I will reconvene in 10 minutes in the roll call room. So that'll be at 8:18. Everybody in the public out there, thank you very much for joining in, and we will see you tentatively. My apologies.
Commissioner Grant, I need just a minute to send you a link once I
Tentatively, we'll see you all at our next commission meeting, which is the 27th of July. Awesome. Thank you. Have a great night.
Landon, who's taking over?
Meeting by ourselves.
Oh, I'll do that right now.
I'd love to do that in public.
Yeah, absolutely.
Veronica Lindstrom. She worked for the city council to